Father, we're thankful for all of your goodness, your grace, and your mercy. Thankful for your word. I pray tonight, Lord, you will bless your word as it goes out. Anoint it. Anoint my lips to say those things you'd have me to say. Anoint our hearts to receive. And we thank you in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen. All right. So, Saul now is dead. David has moved down to Hebron, where he was anointed king of Judah. Not of all of Israel, just of Judah. And first, you have to excuse me. I know I've got sinus infection. There's something going on here, so I've got my Kleenex and something to drink, so I hope I can make it through. Anyway, so he's at Hebron, and he's now the king of the one tribe of Judah. And we pick it up now in chapter 3, beginning with verse 1. Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. But David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Sons were born to David in Hebron. Firstborn was Amnon, and this was by Ahinoam, the Jebusite. His second son was Caleb by Abigail, who, remember, she was the widow of Nabal. The third, Absalom, who was the son of Maakoth. I wish they just had a regular good old American name. It would have been so much easier. And the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth son, Adonijah, the son of Hegath. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth was Yarathon, and he was the son of Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron. Now this is interesting, So he had 6 sons in Hebron. But I think it's kind of interesting when you dig into these a little bit. A lot of the names, Amnon, that meant faithful. Faithful. And you remember now, this was Ahinoam, who was the son of Saul. And this is, the wife of Saul, who David took after Saul had given away Michal, his wife. He went and took one of Saul's wife for himself. So he just switched.
I did not.
You're going to take my wife, I'll take your wife.
No, I
What's that?
I didn't know that.
I
I
don't
know
believe me.
I
What the heck is going on?
Saul's wife.
Yeah. We learned that in,
Hell no.
was it 1 Samuel? I think it talked about it. It just mentions it. It doesn't go into great detail. It just says who was Saul's wife, the Jezreelite who was Saul's wife, and he took her to be his wife. And it's interesting because she's always the first one listed. And you would think it would be Abigail, because Abigail was more a love story. And this lady seemed to be more a political move. You take my wife, I'll take your wife. Kind of a thing.
Isn't that funny? I've never heard that before.
Yeah. So, and this kind of adds to the story as we go along here tonight, because you're going to find out that Michal comes back. So, it's kind of a situation.
David was a polygamist.
Then you have Caleb. If you're like me, you learn something new all the time.
I knew you were a polygamist.
You have Caleb, which means like his father. And that was the son of Abigail. And you remember that was the Nabal, though she was the wife of Nabal, whom the Lord slew.
Yeah.
And then you have Absalom. And we're going to run into this guy later.
I've
But
heard of him.
the name of that is My Father is Peace. My Father is Peace. And he was the son of Maakoth. Now she was the daughter of Talmai, who was king of Geshur. Now that's an interesting You know, why would they put that in there? And I'm one of these people who say, if there's something in there, there must be a reason to have it in there. So, you know, I've said before, I always ask why. You know, why is that in there? Why is that so important that out of these 6 wives, the first 3, he had to give some background, and the others, he just mentions them, gives them by name, and that's the end of them. Who were they? Well, this one, her father was the king of Geshur. Now, that was part of what is now Syria, that stretched along the eastern seaboard of the Sea of Galilee, which is now the West Bank, I believe. No, the Golan Heights, I believe, is what they call it now. You know, where they set up shop. The roads, you know, we were up there and there were snipers shooting at the road. Well, they weren't doing it when we were there, but that's what they did. But, and what this seems to think, a lot of the scholars think, is that this was another one of the marriages for political reasons. Because David, he was king over Judah, and there was 11 other tribes, and they were warring with Judah all the time. That's how this chapter opens up. Now, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. You remember the house of Saul, Ishbosheth, he was Saul's son, who was not in the military. He's either too young, or some even think he just flat wasn't smart enough. But anyway, he stayed home. And so he became king. And it was Abner that set up the 11 kings or elders of Israel. They joined forces and made this Ishbosheth king. Well, those 11 formed the nation of Israel as it was then. And then you had the nation of Judah under David. Well, he was outgunned, outmanned, you know, and they were constantly at war. By making an alliance through a marriage with this king who was on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, that gave him a northern confederate. So if things got really tight, he could always call that king, and he can move his army down from the north. And that would put Israel in between the armies of Judah and the armies of this guy up in the north, and so you had a better chance of getting some victory there. So a lot of the commentaries, they think this was more a political move and to give him some military advantage, since he was so greatly, you know, outnumbered. Now, so this is what happened, and remember now, this was at Hebron. Now, I even read one commentary that said, well, this last person down here that's mentioned, this Eglah, that was probably Michal, and you know, she had gone to Hebron and had children there. No, she came to Hebron just before he moved to Jerusalem.
She never had any children. Michal never had any children.
Well, they said that's not necessarily true. She didn't have any after she, you know, criticized David for dancing.
Yeah.
But it didn't say that she didn't have any before that. So the commentaries are all pretty much, they don't have any record of it, but it just doesn't say that she didn't say that she did prior to that part. Yes.
Well, wasn't, if she was betrothed to David because he slew Goliath, they're not, you know, she had to have kids.
She may have, that's what they're saying, she may have, but these were ones that were born to David in Hebron, and that's the key, in Hebron. I mean, he may have had more kids, I don't know.
Probably think so.
I don't know, maybe.
He was a polygamist after all.
You know, he was there for a few years. He was about 7 years, I think, in Hebron as king of Judah. So, you know, it's not beyond imagination to think he may have had a whole bunch more kids, but these were the ones that were mentioned for a specific reason. All right.
Well, I was going to ask you, what happened to, I thought, tribe of Dan?
What's that?
Tribe of Dan?
Dan?
Yeah, I thought there was another tribe with,
That was later,
okay.
when the two tribes split, you know, when
Okay.
Judah and Dan split
Okay,
from the other 10 tribes.
okay.
Yeah, that's at a little bit later date.
That's when Dan came in.
Yeah. This is, This isn't one you hear much about, this split here, really. It was just, nobody ever talks much about it preaching. It's just kind of there. The other one, there's a whole lot of stuff goes on. All right, let's move on to verse 6. Now it was so, while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner was strengthening his hold on the house of Saul. And Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. So Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why have you gone into my father's concubine?" Then Abner became very angry at the words of Ishbosheth and said, "Am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I show loyalty to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not delivered you into the hand of David, and you charge me today with a fault concerning this woman. May God do so to Abner, and more also, if I not do for David as the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan to Beersheba." And he could not answer Abner another word, because he feared him. So we have kind of a little comparison here. It says that when these wars were going on between Ishbosheth and David, or their armies, David gained strength, while the house of Saul became weaker. So in other words, David was gaining more, he won most of the battles or raids or whatever was going on. And at the same time, he gained prestige, he gained wealth, he gained, everything. He just going up. And Ishbosheth and the what was in the nation of Israel was going down. And in the midst of this, you have Abner. Now, he was the commander of Ishbosheth's army. And so while the house of Ishbosheth, or Saul, was going down, he was getting stronger. In other words, he was gaining more esteem in the country. He had more power. And in fact, if you read kind of between the lines, he was really the guy that was controlling everything in the 11 tribes. And if you remember, he was the one who went in and said, "We're not going with David, we're going to go over here and set Ishbosheth up to be king." Ishbosheth, rather. We're going to set him up to be king. So it was Abner who actually went against the will of God and the prophecies of Samuel and set Ishbosheth up. And I think if you read here, if you look at this carefully, and then you read Josephus and some of the other historians, this guy was really not much of a king. He really was not forward. He was not a military guy. And so everything fell to Abner. And Abner was a guy who was really getting things going. And so he gave all of his power and support to Ishbosheth. Okay? At some point, Ishbosheth realized that Abner was really gaining more power than he wanted him to gain. And I'm sure he was afraid that what was going to happen was that Ishbosheth was going to take over the throne.
No, you mean after.
I mean, that Abner would take over the throne from Ishbosheth. Yes, thank you. And so what he did is he called in Abner and he accused him of sleeping with one of Saul's concubines, this Rizpah.
Now, where was Saul during? He just let him do that?
No, he's dead.
He's dead.
Dead,
Saul's
yeah,
dead. Oh, that's
that's
right.
right. Saul's gone. Yeah, he's dead. And
He went off.
and in those days, if the king died, all of his wives, concubines, everything he had, went to the son who ascended to the throne after him. So technically, all of the concubines and wives belonged to Ishbosheth. So, now whether this event ever happened or not, We don't know. Abner never admitted to it, but what he did do is get extremely
I was
angry.
gonna say, he sure got angry.
Yeah.
Yes, he
Yeah.
did, in a hurry. I mean, in a snap, he was very angry. And when you look at it from his perspective, if he didn't, then what Ishbosheth was trying to do was accuse him of trying to take the throne, because if you took
yeah.
the king's wife or concubines,
Right.
that was a form of taking the throne or trying to usurp yourself into that position. And so he had a legal ground then to say, you know, you've got to, you know, here it is.
Abner was a sneaky guy.
What's that?
Yeah.
Abner was a sneaky guy.
Oh, he was. Yes, Abner was extremely crafty. I think is the best way to put it. But that was one of the things that made him so successful. He was, well, we're going to see what David has to say about him here in a little bit. But whether he did or whether he didn't isn't the issue with Abner. It was that even though he had given everything, all of his power, everything behind Ishbosheth, here for what would even be considered a minor infraction, you know, I mean, you could, if you wanted to raise the case for usurping the throne, you probably could based on it, but it was such a minor thing. I mean, a concubine was just,
Property.
you know, it was one of the slaves.
It was his property.
Yeah. And even if he did, to bring that up to Abner as an accusation of usurping the throne would have been completely irrational. I mean, here's the guy that set you up. Here's the guy that keeps you on the throne, and you're going to insult him. You know, and so, and Abner took it that way. All right, Abner took it that way. So what did he say? He said, well, I'll tell you what. If that's the way you feel about it, here's what's going to happen. I have given everything to you. I've given you all my power, everything, and I've backed you. I've been loyal to you and to the house of Saul all this time. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be just as loyal to David. In other words, I'm going to go over to his side. I'm taking all my power, all my authority, all my craftiness and everything, and I'm going to go serve David. You know, this kind of gives you some feel for Ishbosheth. You know, the position that he was in as far as his ability, how his leadership was. Now, there were several reasons why Abner may have had this response. The first one, to me anyway, is that he understood the rise of David's popularity. If there was anything about Abner, he wasn't stupid. He saw what was happening. He saw David was the one who was rising while everything he was trying to do was going downhill. He was rising in strength within the 11 tribes, but not within Judah. And he could see that the tribe of Judah, if it kept going, was going to just eventually take in. So he wasn't stupid. He saw the end was in sight. He knew Ishbosheth wasn't worth having on a throne. He wasn't going to do anything. He's a milquetoast. You know, he probably couldn't even make a decision if he had to. Abner had to. So he could see all of that coming, and so he no doubt assumed that David would soon be strong enough to defeat Israel and unite the whole nation by force, by just a simulation. He also understood that God had decreed that David would be the king of Israel, and all his efforts could not change that.
That's right, yeah.
And he admits to that in a minute here. So there was two reasons I think Abner decided to throw his lot in with David. This was, to me, and the way this transpires and his snappiness to come to this conclusion kind of tells me he'd been thinking about it for a while. He was probably saying, you know, I think I better reevaluate my position here. Maybe it's time to switch sides. And so he may have been looking for the opportunity In fact, this whole thing may have been a setup, just for that reason, with his concubine. Just so he could have this opportunity to tell Ishbosheth, hey,
Yeah.
you go over, I'm gonna go over here, you got it, it's all yours.
Yeah.
And notice what Ishbosheth did. Absolutely nothing. Now, you know, if he'd have walked up to Saul and said that, or David, or just about any other king, you know, he would have been picking his head up all
Yeah.
the, you know, I mean, that would have been the end of it. But Ishbosheth couldn't even do that. He was fearful of Abner. Of course, not that he didn't have a right to be somebody of Abner's esteem. But you see, he wasn't much of a king. All right, we're going to go fairly quickly through this tonight. There isn't really a whole lot of the deep spiritual lessons here. There's a few, but not a lot. All right, let's pick up with verse 12. Then Abner sent messengers on his behalf to David, saying, whose is the land? Saying also, make your covenant with me, and indeed my hand shall be with you to bring all Israel to you. And David said, good, I will make a covenant with you. But one thing I require of you, you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see my face. So David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, from Peltiel, the son of Laish. Then her husband went along with her to Baharim, weeping behind her. So Abner said to him, go, return, and he returned. So this is a little bit of a kind of a funny story, part of it here, I think, in some ways.
I've been in a long time.
But Abner, after he left King Ishbosheth, he sent messengers to David, and he had a plan. He had a proposal. He said, if you'll go along with me, he says, you know, who owns this land? Whose land is this? It wasn't Judah's land, and it wasn't, you know, it was all God's land that he had given to Israel. So technically, all the land belonged to Israel. It was divided up between the 12 tribes, but, you know, it was all Israel, the nation Israel. So what Abner is saying here, you know, why are we fighting over this? It all belongs to all of us. You see, he was not only crafty and sly, but he was intelligent. He was smart. He knew the scriptures. He knew what God had said. He knew what God intended. And so this is a very logical question. And I think that's why David was so quick to say, good. You want to make a covenant with me? We'll work together. I will support you. And you know, it was like the covenant between David and Jonathan. It was a lifelong covenant. And this is what Abner is proposing here. Let's be not only friends, but let's be allies for life. A covenant. David said, good. I kind of like that answer. You know, he didn't embellish it. He didn't say, well, you know, I'm sure glad you finally woke up, you know, or anything. He just said, good. But there's one thing. When you come, you better have Michal with you. Or don't bother. You'll never see me until you have Michal. To me, it's kind of interesting that he makes this to Abner. Why would he make this statement to Abner? Because he knew Abner was a guy in control. However, because of the law of the land in those days, and the traditional laws of Canaan and in that particular part of the land, the king had to agree to any kind of a transfer of wives in this kind of thing. You couldn't just go out and legally do it. You know, I know David did, but that was a little different because he was at war. And so you took the spoils, you know, that was kind of the other part of it. If you could capture them, then that was fine. But this kind of an agreement had to be okayed by the king. And so, and this is, I've read that in a couple of commentaries, by the way, that agree with that. So what David did next is, while Abner was receiving the message that he had to bring Michal with him, David was acquiring that permission. And so he sent messengers to Ishbosheth and told him, I want my wife. I paid for her. She's legally mine, and I want her. So, you know, in this here, of course, we just see the synopsis of what was said. I'm sure David laid out his legal position to Ishbosheth. And under the law, if you had paid for a wife like that and she was betrothed, she was yours, and anything that went against that was illegal. And so he laid out a very legal reason why Ishbosheth should take Michal and send her home to David with Abner, since Abner was coming that way anyway. So Ishbosheth does it. Now the interesting thing here is Ishbosheth's lack of a response. He didn't say anything, as far as we know. He just did it. But there may have been two reasons for that. One, of course, was the law said to do it. But the other one was he may have been hoping that Michal would be in David's house kind of either as a spy, or that having her there would be an influence on David to act kindly towards Ishbosheth. You know, by not raising a fuss, by just sending his wife over there, maybe David then would see some mercy towards him. Because without Abner, he didn't have much of a defense.
Right, yeah.
He still had his army, he still had all the Benjamites. I mean, he still had a pretty good force there. But without the craftiness and the military ability of Abner, he was missing quite a bit there. So that's where we kind of the comical part of this. I mean, you can just see they go over, a couple of guards go over to this guy's house, Beharim, to this Paltiel. Goes over to the house, knocks on the door, and said, "Pack up, you're going with us, Michal. You're going back over to David. Oh, and she's not your wife anymore. The king signed the decree, and you're no longer, that's gone." So as they're going down the road, here's this guy walking along behind, and he's bawling and crying and carrying on, real manly, real manly. But I think this tells us something also about Michal. We often, when we think about Michal, we think about David dancing and Michal, making fun of it all. But you also, when you look back at the beginning, the reason that David married Michal in the first place was that she was in love with him. That's what it said. She fell in love with David. And so, Saul said, "Well, I'll give you Michal." Why? Because she wanted him. Now, Saul didn't want to really give him anything much. But, hey, that was what she wanted, and so she got what she wanted. But she must have been not only a very beautiful young lady, but also a very good wife. Because this guy wouldn't have been acting the way he was acting if she was just the king's snotty daughter, that I got because of some favors I did for the king. There must have been something about her that made her an ideal type wife. And he was losing something. And so I think it tells us a little bit about Michal. Even in her, later on when she, laughed at David and then kind of got after him, was it really because of her pride or because of her love for him that she didn't want him to appear like an imbecile or something, doing all of this? So, you have to look at it from a little different perspective maybe of her than what we've had in the past. All right, so they finally came to this place, city of Barim, which is on the border between Benjamin and Judah. And Abner, he's had enough of this. He just goes back and says, all right, that's it, go home. And this guy wasn't going to argue with Abner. You didn't want to argue with Abner unless you were a pretty good-sized boy. You didn't want to mess with him. That was the last that we see of this Phaltiel. All right, verse 17. Now Abner had communicated with the elders of Israel, saying, in time past you were seeking for David to be king over you. Now then, do it. For the Lord has spoken of David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel, from the hand of the Philistines and the hand of all their enemies. And Abner also spoke in the hearing of Benjamin. Then Abner also went to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron, all that seemed good to Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. And 20 men with him came to David at Hebron, and David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. Let's see, where are we at? Oh. Then Abner said to David, I will arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may reign over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. All right, some things interesting here that I think transpired. First of all, before Abner went to meet with David, he met with all the elders of Israel. Now, whether he went from tribe to tribe or they had a summit meeting somewhere, I don't know. But it says here that he talked with them. He communicated with the elders of Israel. Now, how he did it in person or if he sent messengers, I don't know. But he said, in times past, you wanted David to be your king. And even before Saul had been killed, in 1 Samuel 18:5, we find that they wanted David. They thought David was, they were extolling David. This was when, David has killed his 10,000 and Saul his 1,000. And during that period of time, the elders really wanted David to be king. And I think what they were saying among themselves, and I wasn't there, and I haven't heard anybody who was there that says much about it, but I can imagine them maybe in private conversation saying, I think we made a mistake. I don't think we really should have had Saul. I don't think he's really, we should have listened to Samuel, because Samuel told us what was going to happen. And we just ignored him, went on anyway. He said, maybe we chose the wrong guy. David, probably a better choice, And Abner knew about this, and so he says, that's who you really wanted in the first place. You've wanted this for a long time. Now, since he was the main force that was holding the nation of Israel together, that was Abner, he was releasing them to make their own decisions and about joining their former enemy. Prior to this time, I can see where the elders of Israel would have been very reluctant to go against Abner. He was the head of the army, and what he said, he no doubt had a very loyal army force. The Benjamites were behind him, and if they decided they wanted to go join David, they might have Abner on. And so, by saying this, do it, he's saying, I'm releasing you. If you want to make that decision, go ahead and make it. What I find is interesting is he didn't say, we're going to do it. In other words, we're going to do it whether you like it or not. I'm turning this all over, and you better follow along. Rather, he said, since this is what you wanted, go ahead and do it. So he was leaving it more up to them to make that decision. But the way he tones it, I think it was obvious to them that he was going on that side. So if they didn't go with David and they stayed the way they were losing their commander, they were losing the strength of their army, they were losing everything. So while he didn't demand that they go join David, I think the pressure was there from his statements. However, when we read through here again, in the next section, we find out that they all really agreed to that. It was something they all thought was the right way to go. So there didn't seem to be any contention there. Notice the next group he met with were the Benjamites. Now he gave probably the same argument to the Benjamites that he gave to the other 10 tribes. Why did he do the Benjamites separately? Why not just call them all together? Well, who was the main force behind Ishbosheth? Were the Benjamites. They were his private army. They were the guards around him. They were the ones who followed Abner. They were the forefront of this whole thing of having the 11 tribes together. So it was the Benjamites who really held kind of the upper hand as far as the military side of things were concerned. They were the trained fighters. They were the elite. They were the ones who you wanted to be sure were on your side. And so he talked to them. After he talked to them, because by the way, they would be the most likely to oppose this plan, would be the Benjamites. They would make the biggest opposition to the whole idea. Abner took 20 men. Now these 20 men, it doesn't say who they were, but there is and there's an assumption in the commentaries that because Abner had Michal with him, who was Saul's daughter, part of royalty, she would have been traveling with an entourage of some kind, especially since she's going to become the wife of the king again, you know. So these 20 people that were with him, 20 men, were part of the royal guard, if you will, that went with Michal, their secret service in those days. And they were, of course, all under the authority of Abner. So that would make sense of why the 20 men were with him.
Yeah.
When he got there, when he got to Hebron, David has this big feast for him. And you know, this is, when you think, here they've been fighting now for several years. I think they figured there was probably 5 to 7 years of hard fighting between these two nations on and off. They never really mounted a big invasion type thing, but it was this constant bickering, like what we see today, in the Near East. I mean, you don't see Iran suddenly swooping down to invade Saudi Arabia or vice versa, but there's these little skirmishes and there's little stuff going on all the time, and that's kind of what was going on there. And this type of warfare is thousands of years old. It is still going on today. But all this had, I'm sure, taken its toll, and people, begin to have some pretty strong opinions on one side or the other. In fact, you notice when Ishbosheth accused Abner of sleeping with the concubine, what did he say? Am I a dog's head from Judah? In other words, am I just a dog's head? A dog, if you accuse somebody of being a dog, you're accusing them of the lowest thing you can possibly do. That's why the Jews all called the Gentiles dogs. Dogs. He took it a step further. Am I just a dog's head? Not even the whole dog. Am I that what I am? So, you see this animosity that had been built up. And so, in trying to unify these nations, you had all that animosity that had been building up. So how do you overcome that? It was a difficult situation. So David had a feast for him. Now this was customary when you were about to enter into a covenant to have a feast. And if you've noticed the news, anytime somebody comes over here, or our president goes someplace else, and they're going to sign a treaty, what do? They have a feast. Now that's the only thing that would be attractive to me, to be a politician at that level, is I could go and eat. You see, now that would do it. I mean, you give me You're gonna sit me down on this stuff with gold forks and knives and feed me all of this. Oh man, hey, I'll be your politician for a couple of years. I have no problem with that. Otherwise, no thank you. That's the only part. But you know, it always seems to be around a meal that you find camaraderie, and you find a point where you can come together and you can talk and you can come to conclusions around a meal.
Right.
And especially if you have a lot of wine going, then everything goes real smooth, and everybody signs everything off, and in the morning say, did I sign that?
Yeah.
Anyway, so they had this feast, and it doesn't talk anything about what went on right after that, but apparently after the feast and the ceremonies that were associated with these covenants, and you'd have to go back into the law to see what went on when you had a covenant with somebody. We saw a little bit of it with David and Jonathan's covenant, but they had these ceremonies that they went through. And the covenant was that Abner that agreed with David that he would support David and David would become the king. And so Abner then left, departed the party to go and gather all the elders of Israel together and to come then and proclaim David to be their king, to switch alliance. All right. And notice this, it said David sent him away in peace. That meant that he had David's protection as long as he was in Judah. He went away in peace. All right, let's see how well that lasted. Verse 22. At that moment, right then, the servants of David and Jacob, or Joab rather, came from a raid and brought much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the troops that were with him had come, they told Joab, saying, Abner of Ner came to the king, and he sent him away, and he has gone in peace. Then Joab came to the king and said, What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why is it that you sent him away, and he has already gone? Surely you realize that Abner, the son of Ner, came to deceive you, to know you're going out and you're coming in, and to know all that you are doing. And when Joab had gone from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, who brought him back from the well of Sirah. But David did not know it. Now when Abner had returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him privately. And there he stabbed him in the stomach so that he died for the blood of Ashel, his brother. Afterward, when David heard it, he said, My kingdom and I are guiltless before forever of the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. Let it rest on the head of Joab and all his father's house. Let there never fail to be in the house of Joab one who has a discharge or is a leper, who leans on a staff or falls by the sword, who lacks bread. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel at Gibeon in the battle. All right, so while David was meeting with Abner, Joab had taken the army, and at least some of the army, some of David's men, evidently part of his 600 mighty men, and defeated a band of robbers that may have taken advantage of the rift between Judah and the rest of Israel to go on a raiding party. You know, and we've seen already how this worked. You know, these nomads would come through and raid and whatever. And so they finally, excuse me, probably figured that David was so preoccupied with this war or these skirmishes with Israel that he wouldn't pay attention to a raiding party. Well, that was probably a bad assumption. Because it said that Joab came back into town and they had all kinds of spoils, all kinds of loot. So they had met and defeated these nomadic raiders and taken everything that they had gathered in all of their raiding up to that point and brought it back to David. This is part of David becoming stronger and stronger, wealthier and wealthier. Now,
I'm good, thank you. Go ahead.
Joab, when he got back into town, now we don't know how long it was that he was informed, from the fact that it says in that moment, at that time when Joab left town, to the time that Abner had left town, from that time until Joab's men caught up with him, he had gone about 2 miles. So you figure in those days they probably covered maybe 5 miles in an hour. So they hadn't really gone very far, very, very long. Probably something less than an hour that they had walked out of town. So Joab, he returned with all of this loot, and then he became upset with David. And he went into David, and this is probably one of the things that is kind of puzzling to me, is the way he talked to David. He went in there, and he said, Abner the son of Ner came to the king, and you sent him away, and he's gone in peace, and what's the matter with you, David? Don't you know that God delivered him into your hand? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah,
At least on 2 different occasions,
right.
he was told God has delivered somebody into 2 times. It was Saul. Now it's Abner. God has delivered him into your hand. In other words, why didn't you just take him right there and kill him? He's your enemy. And that's the way the world thinks. That's the way that they do things. It was kind of interesting coming in tonight, a little bit off the subject, a little bit on it too. I was listening to NPR, National Public Radio, and they were interviewing this woman. She was used to be a professor at PLU, and anyway, she's heading up this thing on media, total media, what do they call it, media intelligence, I think. It's courses in being smart about media. And they were asking about different, what is this? What's media? And all. And she got into talking about things like, when you go out on social media, or you're listening to a news broadcast, and somebody makes a statement, do you bother to go see what they base that statement on? Do you go, when they quote somebody, do you go back and see who that person is? Where the report came from? She said the biggest problem today is they see something on Facebook, they see the headline, and the next thing you know, they're sharing it with somebody, and this is terrible. They didn't even read the article, let alone find out on who wrote the article and from what agenda are they writing the article from. That's why we have today, the people over here that are saying, oh, we've got to do everything we can because of climate change. And then you got people over here that are saying we can't do anything about it, it's all part of the cycle of, and so you have these 2 sides, and there's scientists on both sides, and every time that they find something, everybody on this side jumps up and cheers and writes all kinds of stuff, and then they find something, everybody over here jumps up and cheers. It's a matter of not taking the time to really understand what's going on. And we saw that with Joab. He hears that Abner was there. He's here to spy. He's here to lie. He's just a dirty cheat. And so he comes at the king with this, and we don't know what David replied. I'm sure David had a reply for him. I don't think David just looked at him and walked away. I'm sure he had something to say about it. But Joab took this opportunity to use the visit to David as an excuse. And so he came out from his meeting with David, and he sent his men after Abner, and he said, bring him back here. Now, evidently, he used a lie himself, and probably told him, tell Abner the king needs to see him, he has something else to talk to him about. Otherwise, why would he go 2 miles out there and have to come back 2 miles? That's a ways to walk. I know I don't like to walk 2 feet, and let alone 2 miles. But, so his men went out, and told Abner, come on back. About 2 miles. But we find Joab's plan was not to capture Joab. It wasn't even really to kill Joab, who was the head of the Israel's army. It was to exact revenge. Revenge. Yeah, Abner, I'm sorry. Abner. So when Abner reached Hebron, where David was, then Joab met him in the gate. All right? And, you know, we sing some of the gates of the cities there in Israel. And they had recesses in the gates, and there was areas what they termed within the gate where they sold merchandise, and this was all considered within the gate, not just in the little 2-foot area that had no wooden door. And this whole area was considered the gate. And so evidently Joab took Abner to a quiet, secret place, or a place where he could deliver a secret message, and there he stabbed Abner and killed him. He could have used the excuse, and he probably did, that Abner was a so I'm making sure that he doesn't take anything back, from what he learned. However, that didn't fly well with David, particularly. And when David heard it, David's response was to say that he and the kingdom of Judah was not responsible. You see, Joab, number one, acted very irresponsibly. He didn't think the matter through.
Right.
He thought, this is my opportunity to exact revenge because Abner killed my brother, therefore I have a right to kill him. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Here we go, this is my chance. What he didn't realize was the implications that could make to the other 11 kings and their armies and their allies. It could have brought complete war to the nation of Israel. I mean, you're not just killing some guy in the military, you're killing the top dog, the most important person in all of Israel. He didn't think about that. His only thought was his own revenge, his own anger, his own need to do something. Isn't that what we see a lot of politics based on today? It's not for the best of the country, it's for what these politicians think, or what will make them look good. Or in the case of the Democrats, maybe it's revenge because of Republican presidency. And their fair darling didn't make it. And on the Republican side, it's for something else. I'm not taking sides here. I'm merely saying we see it today. It hasn't changed. And we see all of these excuses for why people do things. So what does David do? Verse 28, he said, when David heard about it, the first thing he did is he said, me and my kingdom are not responsible. We are guiltless of this. In other words, I did not order Abner to be killed. I didn't even know anything about it. And then he goes on to say that he pronounces a curse on the house of Joab. Now, it's one thing to deny something, and then it's another thing to put a curse on somebody. What he's saying here is, I didn't have anything to do with it, it was Joab. And so I'm now going to pass Joab, I'm going to pass judgment on Joab, not physically, but I'm going to allow God to judge Joab. I'm going to have God do it. And so what he cursed Joab with is, let me back up a minute and explain something here. Joab was running under assumption or under the use of the Goel. You remember our study of Ruth. We talked about the redeeming kinsman, or the kinsman redeemer, however we will look at it. And it was a responsibility of the next of kin to take care of a widow, that sort of thing. Well, there was another part of that, and that was that if your kin was unjustly killed or unlawfully killed, in other words, it could have been a manslaughter, it could have been, whatever, then you had the right and the responsibility to kill that person.
Oh,
That was called the blood redemption. The blood redemption. And I'm not going to go into the rest of that, but you can. But so what Joab was claiming is that he was avenging the blood of his brother, because you remember his younger brother was running after Saul, or after Ahab. I just jumped a few 100 yards ahead. After Abner, and he was catching Abner, and Abner warned him twice, don't come any closer,
Yeah.
I'm going to kill you. And he kept coming, and he came up, and he got him with the spear.
Yeah.
This was in a battle. You could not
Oh.
claim redemption blood if it was a battle. This was not an accident. This was not manslaughter. When you go into a battle, you lose your right to claim any intention of murder on the other person, as it is in the field of battle and in that arena of battle. Now, if you take somebody and you're holding them captive and you shoot them when their hands are tied, now that's murder, okay? But in this case, it was not. And David knew that, as well as Joab. But he was using that as an excuse to cover his illegal actions. And so David put this curse on him. His offspring would be diseased, they would have leprosy, or they'd be lame, or they would commit suicide or die by the sword, or be impoverished. All of his ancestors, or his relatives, would go through this, his offspring. Now that's a pretty severe curse to put on somebody. What David did not do is have Joab put to death. Now he was quick to do that for other things, but not quick to do it for this. Why do you think that was? Anybody have a thought? Who was Abner?
He was probably a little afraid of Abner.
What's that?
He was a little afraid of Abner, maybe.
I don't know that he was absolutely afraid of him, because I think David probably, he didn't fear anything, really. I don't think there was that fear of
Well,
that.
At least he knew what he was up to.
But I think what he was afraid of was the influence that Joab had with the army.
I was going to say, wasn't he the head of the army, Joab?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so if he would have put Joab to death, or had him put to death, it would have signaled two or three things. First of all, it would have said that David was a poor selector of commanders. It would reflect on his ability, because Joab reported to him. It would also then open the opportunity for a mutiny within the army, or a faction within the army, which would destroy Judah, or at least tear it apart and destroy everything he was working on with Abner, to put this thing together. And it left him open for foreign invasion. So I think David's main concern was not for himself. I don't think he was afraid of Joab. I think he figured he knew he had the anointing of God, and if Joab came on him, I'm quite sure he'd handle him just like he did the bear. So I don't think it was a personal problem as much as a fear for the nation and for what God was trying to accomplish. And so he didn't want to do something that would put that in jeopardy. And I think that's a good lesson for us. Sometimes we want to have our own ideas and our own solutions, but we need to really be able to look at it and say, what are the consequences and what's the best course of action? So for David, the best course of action was to leave it up to God. It's up to you, God. You pour out the judgment. All right. Notice there's one other little thing here. It says, so Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner. Now, we didn't see any statement that Abishai was there, but either he was there, or it's just merely because he was in on the scheme.
Yeah.
All right, verse 31, 39. Then David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, tear your clothes, gird yourselves with sackcloth, and mourn for Abner. And King David followed the coffin, or the pyre. So they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all of the people wept. And the king sang a lament over Abner, and said, your hands were not bound, nor your feet put in fetters. As a man falls before wicked men, so you fell. Then all the people wept over him again. And when all the people came to persuade David to eat food while it was still day, David took an oath, saying, God, do so to me and more also, if I taste bread or anything else till the sun goes down. Now all the people took note of it, and it pleased them, since whatever the king did pleased all the people. For all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's intent to kill Abner the son of Ner. Then the king said to his servants, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And I am weak today, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too harsh for me. The Lord will repay the evildoer according to his wickedness. So David turned around and he told Joab and all the men that were with him, all right, now put on sackcloth, pour ashes on your head, and you mourn for Saul.
For Abner.
You killed him, for Abner. You killed him, now you mourn for him. I can't keep it all straight.
We knew what you meant.
Yeah, we knew what you meant.
Yeah, well, I hope you can all follow me. I'm not quite all here tonight, so I'm never all here, I guess, anyway. But so he had them all mourn and weep. You know, that's a lot of punishment right there. You know, having to be so ashamed, or at least in the eyes of the people, shamed by having to now mourn the person that you hated so much that you even went against the interests of the king in order to kill him. And then David followed the coffin. Now this simple little statement doesn't really mean much until you understand that the kings in those days didn't follow coffins or pyres. What they had was like a frame, a wooden frame, and they put the body on it, and they would either two men carry it, or it would have a wheel, and it would be pulled. Kind of like an oversized wheelbarrow kind of thing. The king would go first. He always went first with his soldiers, and then the coffin would come along. But David followed the coffin. What this did was show servitude to Abner. David was saying, Abner is greater than me. Abner was greater than me. He put that humility on. And how many times have we seen this with David? This humility of, first of all, saying it's my fault. You know, he would take the blame first. And I think we even see that maybe in his judgment of Joab. He didn't kill him because he would say, it's really my fault. I'm the top of the chain. Buck stops here. It's really my fault. I'd have to kill myself if I killed Joab. Because that was David's attitude. And so he followed the coffin. They buried him in the tomb. And of course, David then wept. But he wrote this little song. And it's interesting, this lamentation. Starts off and he said, should Abner die as a fool dies? Why, Abner, did you die like a fool? Your hands weren't bound. You didn't have chains on your feet. You know, you could have gotten away. You could have used your brains. You're not really, you know, you're a very sharp guy. You should have known. In fact, he did know, because you remember when Abner was running away from Ashiel, he says, you know, stop, because I don't want to face your brothers. In other words, I don't want to have to kill your brothers.
Yeah.
He knew that they would come after him if, if he killed the, And yet here he goes, and here comes Abner, and says, oh, come over here in a quiet place where we're all alone, just you and me. Now, normally a man of war like that, he would have pulled out his sword and said, okay, let's go someplace where it's quiet. We're going to talk if you want to talk. If you don't, we might as well settle it here. But he didn't seem to have any indication that there was anything wrong in this situation. He was a military man. He was a leader. He should have sensed that there was something wrong.
Yeah.
David would not have had him in his house with a full feast and then call him back and have Abner meet him in the gate. It didn't make sense. And that's what David is alluding to here. Your hands weren't tied, your feet weren't in chains. Why did you come back and not be alert, not be ready to fight? As a man falls before wicked men, so you fell. In other words, you were deceived. The big thing about a wicked man is he deceives you. That's why the devil is a wicked man, or a wicked being, entity, because he deceives. And Abner was a deceiver. So anyway, they all wept, and they came to David, tried to get him to eat something, and he said, I'm not going to eat the rest of the day. This was typical of mourners. They fasted until the sun went down. All fasting stopped when the sun went down. That was the end of the fast for mourning. And by doing this, this is kind of that funny little phrase in here, that it says that it pleased all the people. Well, and whatever the king did pleased all the people. Why put it in there?
Right.
Whatever David did, if he danced on the table, it pleased the people. I mean, whatever he did. But I think this kind of indicates that by David refusing to eat, he was saying, hey, I'm a king. I can do what I want. I'm in charge here. But I am mourning somebody that was greater than I. And I am truly grieved at the death of Abner. And I think that was the case. Abner, for all of his pomp and all of his desires to be in charge and all of these things, he was a military man. He was a very good leader. And he was able to rally people around, to convince people. He was somebody you want on your side. And when he came to David and said, I want to be on your side, David, well, good, yeah. I can see David saying, yeah, that's the guy I've been after. I need him on my side. Do I think he loved him? There was a relationship? No. But I think he realized that this was somebody he needed. And so he mourned. And the mourning and the grief was real. Now notice what he said in verse 38. Do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? This he said to his servants, probably his guards, people with him. He considered Abner to be a true leader. He said, we've lost a prince. A prince was a leader. We have lost a prince, a leader, somebody who had that ability to lead people. I mean, after all, you've got 11 nations, 11 tribes, and you just tell the king that's over them, well, I'm going to go out here and we're all going to go over there. And they do it. That's leadership. That's leadership. But he goes on to say, a great man has fallen. This means he was a highly distinguished man. So many, we think so often of the military guys as being rough and gruff and, just... But David said this was not only a leader, this was not only a real, true military man, but he was distinguished. He carried himself well. He was able to negotiate. He was able to put himself in that position of being called distinguished. And he makes another statement. He says, I am weak today, though anointed king. Some of the commentaries say, well, you know, that's because he hadn't eaten. Come on. He'd only had eaten half a day. Now, you know, you're not going to get weak in a half a day. But rather, what he was saying here is, my kingdom, my rulership, my whole thing is weaker than what it was a few hours ago when Abner agreed in a covenant to be with me. When he signed the covenant, Abner became part of David's kingdom and the strength of that covenant. But now it's been taken away. And he says, I am weaker. He realized what he had lost in David. And and this is where we understand, he says that these two men of Zeruiah are too harsh for me. That means they're too strong for me. Now, that doesn't mean too strong for David to kill him or too strong for David to punish him. It meant that their influence was too strong, that it would cause problems if he punished them. So he's going to just say, too much for me. I'm going to let the Lord repay their wickedness, their deceitfulness. And that always works better anyway. He always has a way of doing it far better than us. All right, let's move on to our last chapter for tonight. Chapter 4, beginning with verse 1. When Saul, I'm sorry. What?
Come on.
Okay. When Saul's son heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost heart, and all Israel was troubled. Now Saul's son had two men who were captains of troops. The name of one was Benai, and the name of the other Rechab. The sons of Ramon the Beerothite, of the children of Benjamin. For Beeroth also was part of Benjamin, because the Beerothites fled to Gittim, and have been sojourners there until this day. Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. And his nurse took him up and fed him. And it happened, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame. His name was Mephibosheth. Then the sons of Ramon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Benan, set out and came at about the heat of the day to the house of Ishbosheth, who was lying on his bed at noon. And they came there all the way into the house, as though to get wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and Benai, his brother, escaped. For when they had come into the house, he was lying on his bed in his bedroom. Then they struck him and killed him, beheaded him, and took his head, and were all night escaping through the plain. This is a bloody period of time in Israel.
Where did these guys come from?
Yeah. It was, I could take care of him, I mean.
Were they from the Rechab people that refused to drink wine?
Were they what?
That part of the tribe of Rechab people that refused to drink wine? They only lived in tents.
I'm not sure on that one. Did it say they didn't drink wine? Is that, yeah, I don't know if this was part of that one or not.
Jeremiah offered them wine, and they refused. They said, you know, our fathers told us never to drink wine, and then also they told them not to build houses and not to stay in one place, in other words, they were nomadic.
Yeah, I don't know if this is, I'm not familiar enough with that one to know if this is the same group. We really, a lot of this is supposition about who these guys were and their tribes. However, we do know this, that when Ishbosheth became aware that Abner had been died, he became very discouraged. I mean, after all, now he has to run the country, you know. All of the leaders were concerned. And what they were probably concerned about is that David might take the opportunity to invade them, or parts of the army, or, this might happen, or because Abner was now dead, that maybe other enemies would come into Israel, knowing that Abner was gone. Now, the one thing they probably didn't know is that Abner had already completed the covenant with David, which would have precluded him from doing anything. Because the word probably hadn't gotten out yet. He'd only made it 2 miles out of town when he was called back. All right? Now there was 2 captains in Ishbosheth's army who were the sons of Rimmon, who was a Beerothite for the tribe of Benjamin. All right? Benaiah and Rechab. Now Beeroth was a city that was associated with the Gibeonites, who were slaughtered by Saul, as referenced in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1 and 2. If that were true, these 2 may have been out to avenge the unnecessary deaths of their countrymen. Now, as far as I know, this battle is never recorded anywhere. I couldn't find it anyway. I looked everywhere I could, and nobody seems to have any record of this battle, except in 2 Samuel 21. God directs that the descendants of Saul that were left were to be destroyed. 7 sons were hung up and were hung, all because Saul unnecessarily slaughtered the city of Gibeon. And it was not under the direction of God. And so, that far down, God's going to bring justice. He doesn't move fast sometimes. It takes a while. But he's always going to do it. Well, what happened then is those who fled that city, which were parts of the Beerothites, were then fled to Gideon, which was a city in Benjamin, and from there became temporary citizens or sojourners. So they were in the nation of Benjamin. They were not necessarily Hebrews, they were Canaanitish, but they became parts, probably by intermarriage, by whatever, they became part of the tribe of Benjamin. And so they were considered Benjamites, but really they were Betherites. Okay? So that's kind of where that comes from. And these 2 brothers were captains in Abner's army. Now, right in the middle of this, we get this information that Jonathan had a son whose name was Mephibosheth, and that when Saul was being defeated by the Philistines at Gibeon, which we learned about a couple of weeks ago, that his nurse took him and fled, and while she was fleeing, she evidently dropped him, or something happened and he became lame.
Right.
Well, the reason that's in here is because a lame man was considered unworthy to be the king. So while Mephibosheth would have been the next heir to the throne behind Saul, he was not, because he was lame. Okay? And Mephibosheth's just going to play a part later on in the life of David. So that's thrown in here, I think, probably to let you know that, yeah, there was one more heir to the throne, but he didn't qualify. You have to remember, in those days, they walked everywhere. If you had somebody lame, how in the world could he lead an army and go into battle and all that? It would be impossible. All right, so these 2 guys, they came to the house of Mephibosheth in the heat of the day with the excuse of getting their rations, because the captains would go into the king's house, and they would have a warehouse there, or a storehouse, and the servants then would get wheat for them, or grain, which they would take back to the troops, and they would have it milled, and then they would have enough to make their food for their cooks and stuff to use. So this was probably what they used that excuse to get into the house. It says they came all the way into the house, and probably at the heat of the day, the guards are probably nodding off, it's hot, and nobody's paying a whole lot of attention, and especially here's 2 captains, military guys, you don't have to worry about them. They slipped upstairs, they stabbed Ishbosheth, they cut off his head, and then they took off and they went all night across the plains. Now remember, they're on the east side of Jordan, so they had to cross the Jordan, come all the way down the plain to get to Hebron. So it was a long, hard journey all night long. Now the fact that they traveled it quickly all night shows that they were afraid that they were going to get caught. Somebody was going to chase them down. So they were moving as fast as they could to get to Hebron. All right, let's finish up. Verse 8. And they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron, and said to the king, Here is the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. And the Lord has avenged my lord the king this day of Saul and his descendants. But David answered Rechab and Banan, his brother, the sons of Rimmon, the Betherite, and said to them, As the Lord lives, who has redeemed as the Lord lived, who has redeemed my life from all adversity? When someone told me, saying, Saul is dead, thinking to have brought good news, I arrested him and had him executed in Ziklag, the one who thought I would give him a reward for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed a righteous person in his own house on his bed? Therefore, shall I not now require his blood at your hand and remove you from the earth? So David commanded his young men, and they executed them, cut off their hands and feet, and hanged them by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner in Hebron. Now these two guys, this is what I in reading makes it so interesting to me. They had the excuse, that this king was a usurper, and really David had been anointed king, and so, this is the guy, he's the last of Saul who's been opposing you, and so we're going to bring you his head, we're going to take his head and give it to David, we're pledging our allegiance to David, and he's going to be so proud of us, and he's going to probably make us captains in his army, and maybe generals, and, I'm going to get all this good stuff. And so they did their deed. And but when you read the background of these Betherites, this was really an avenging of the house of Saul by Abetherites. Saul had slaughtered the Abetherites for no reason at Gibeon, as we learned in 2 Samuel 22. And so, just like Joab killed Abner as an avenging move, so these two killed the remaining son of Saul as an act of avenging. It's interesting how, when you look at these, how they parallel each other. Two sides, and yet the same major reasons happening here. And what makes it even stranger is that David was the one who executed both of them, or executed the judgment on both of them. That's interesting.
Yeah.
All right, so David's response, as he informed them, didn't you hear what I did to that young man who came over here with the good news of the death of Saul and thought I would reward him? I had him executed. How much more do you think I'm going to do to somebody who is assuming to receive a reward when they have done wickedness? When they kill an innocent man in his own house, in his own bed. When you look at Ishbosheth, you don't find where he ever did anything wrong. Certainly not worthy of death. I mean, he wasn't alert enough, I don't think, to do much of anything. He was such a milquetoast kind of a guy. Abner was the one who was out there doing everything. And it appears that he just sat back and was more the paper pusher kind of guy, and they killed him, and it was without merit. And so David had them immediately slain. He cut off their hands and feet. He took the hands and feet and hung them on the wall by the pool there in Hebron. You know, you look at that, what's that all about? Why would he do something like that? It was the hands that killed the king and the feet that provided their escape. That's from the commentaries. That was their reasoning in putting those up. So everybody would know, you don't go against God.
Right.
You cannot go do these things. It was a reminder of saying, this is what you better not do, because as king, this is what will happen to you. And they took the head of Mephibosheth, and they buried it with Abner in his tomb.
What did you say about the feet? Hands that killed and feet
The
that...
feet that provided their escape. Any questions?